Many theorists at the outbreak of the First World War saw the eventual construction of air cruisers a certainty. So much so that nearly all nations involved in the conflict immediately set to work designing such aircraft as early as July 1914. One of the first examples, called a Kampfflugzeug by Germany, was discussed in one of my recent videos you can find here. The idea was a fairly simple one: create a fast, durable airplane with multiple gunners and utilize it to blow holes in enemy air cover for the bombers and scouts to get through. While I could talk at length about this idea, that has to be saved for a future video, as it never really went anywhere. That is, until the French decided to give the idea another try in 1917. I'm Wolf of 1918, and this is a history of the Caudron R.11, the most successful aerial cruiser of the war. If you like aviation history content like this, consider subscribing, or leave a like and a comment to help support the video in the algorithm. Now, onto our regularly scheduled program. The story of this rather unknown twin-engine aircraft finds its start in the years before the war, much like most aerial machines utilized in the conflict. Brothers René and Gaston Caudron, born and raised in the Somme region of France, gained an interest in aviation when René had returned home from his college education and military service. Gaston had been pursuing a college education in engineering, but health problems forced him to drop out of college early. Driven to create their own aircraft, construction on the first of their designs was started in August of 1908. Unable to procure the funds for an engine, they instead flew the large biplane as a glider, using a horse to tow it along at what was probably a frustratingly slow speed. It did give them important experience, however, and by late 1909 they had found an engine to take it up under power, opening their own factory in Rouen, France, that same year. Success was immediate, with the civilian and military industries alike flocking to the Caudron Brothers for aircraft. When war broke out 5 years later, production stopped only briefly, as the brothers were drafted and then, almost instantly, released and sent back home to produce machines for the war effort. These aircraft included the rather successful Caudron G aircraft, a line of very agile reconnaissance aircraft that continued being used as trainers even after the war. One series that began development shortly after the war began was that of the R class. Originally planned for naval use, the R-1 was designed as a float plane with only a single engine and a rather cube-like fuselage. First flown in May of 1915, it showed extremely poor handling and was abandoned along with the incomplete R-2 for the R-III, a twin-engine prototype intended for reconnaissance and potentially light bombing activities. This prototype was improved upon and developed into the R-IV, which took its first flight as early as June 1915. Proving to be an excellent machine for reconnaissance, the line was developed even further. Tragedy struck in December of 1915. Gaston, although banned from test flights by the French Aviation Ministry, took to the skies in one of the brand new R-IV aircraft. Shortly after takeoff, the twin-engine airplane reached an altitude of around 200 meters, close to 600 feet, before suddenly lurching forward. Witnesses reported the aircraft appeared to rapidly lose stability and fell vertically, the crew being thrown out of the now spiraling prototype. All aboard, the mechanic Joams, one of Caudron's designers Diomedes, and Gaston Caudron himself died instantly when they hit the ground. This was a heavy blow to René, who had been the lead designer of the R-IV, especially since the cause of the crash was determined to be severe structural deficiencies within the design. Still, René pressed forward and redesigned much of the airplane, making it a far safer platform. This, however, delayed production well into 1916, and the first R-IV didn't reach active service until October. Although it had rather unimpressive performance, the more than 250 that reached the front lines were well liked by their crews, and gained a reputation for being an easy to defend and hard to shoot down aircraft. Even though the R-IV proved to be a success, it was already outdated by the time it entered service, and a slightly updated version of the design with better engines was entered into production as the R.VIII, with a new variant to serve as a jack-of-all-trades put into development. With René now serving mostly as a test pilot only, the design work of this new aircraft was taken over by one Paul Deville, who would keep the design very close to the mostly successful R-IV and R.VIII airframes. This goal, to keep the R-11 as an observation platform and make it more suited for bombing, was upended by the French military's request for a heavy, long-range escort fighter. With the R-11 providing a near-perfect aerial cruiser platform, it was designed with two gunner positions, each operating twin Lewis guns with an extra gun plan to be swung under the fuselage per gunner position, giving an excellent field of fire. The first of these three crew positions was the nose gunner, placed as far forward as possible so that he would be allowed the best field of fire available. A specialized mount was also installed for the placement of the large observation cameras of the time. The nose position was made to comfortably seat the gunner and give him access to extra ammunition and photographic plates for observation missions. Electrical wires were brought from the starboard wing mounted generator in order to power the wireless telegraph situated in his compartment as well. Just behind where he sat was a pivot for a rear-facing machine gun mounted below the airplane. Provisions were even made for unconventional situations. a hole being cut into the wood panels separating the observer from the pilot just big enough for a man to squeeze through. This was done, according to Caudron literature, just in case an emergency required it. The pilot's position was reportedly comfortable, with a great field of view up and to the sides, although forward visibility was limited. The important thing was the pilot's ability to view both the engines and easily observe the majority of the aircraft's control surfaces quickly. A wheel was used to control the ailerons, with a bar at the pilot's feet for rudder control. The instrument panel included a tachometer, fuel pressure gauge, and cooling water thermometer for each of the two 200-horsepower Hispano-Swayze engines. The throttle, or fuel control levers, were situated to the left of the pilot, with the mixture controls, or air control, situated to his right. This allowed the pilot to trim each engine individually or as one unit. According to reports, the mixture controls were only for operations above 3,000 meters. The seat, too, was adjustable and padded. Another benefit to its design was the ability to place armor plating under the seat without much trouble, allowing extra protection during flights when the extra weight was allowed. Further back, the rear gunner was left with only his single dual Lewis gun defensive armament. According to French reports, the rear gunner's field of fire was excellent, but British reports noted the large blind spot created by the tail and its associated bracing. This deficiency was probably known by the designers and the reason for the forward observer's tail-facing gun placement. The originally planned gun placement along the underbelly for the rear gunner does not appear to have made it into the final design, and if it did, it was rarely used. An interesting addition to the tail gunner's position was that of an auxiliary cockpit. It's not known what event led to the addition of this novelty feature, but it's likely reports of multi-position aircraft being brought down from lucky hits to the pilots inspired its engineering. If the pilot of the R.11 ended up becoming incapacitated, the rear gunner would remove part of the floor of his compartment, revealing slots for the spare rudder bar and control wheel mounted to the walls of the fuselage beside him. While it would take time to set up, it was probably quicker and safer compared to crawling through the fuselage to the cockpit and trying to move the dead or severely wounded pilot in order to access the controls. You'll notice there is no reference to auxiliary controls for the throttle, let alone mixture, so it's possible these controls were only intended to be used long enough for either the pilot to recover or for the forward observer to make his way to the cockpit and take over. Another interesting feature of the R.11 were the usually mundane fuel tanks. Typically, these were situated slightly above the engines in order to operate off of gravity, a simple but reliable way to get the fuel to the engines. Fuel pumps had been tested on earlier aircraft, but they proved too unreliable and too heavy for most of the aircraft of the time. The R.11, however, had a far more complicated setup. Behind each engine, within the nacelle, sat a 250-liter fuel tank. A motor-driven pump pressurized the tanks to force fuel out into the engines. The tank was separated from the oil tank and engines themselves with a thin aluminum sheet. Each of these fuel pods was designed so that, in case of a fuel fire, the pilot could jettison one to get it clear of the aircraft. In order to allow both engines to keep running in this event, the fuel system was designed to be redundant, able to feed both engines from a single fuel tank. This situation wouldn't be an easy one for the crew, however, as both fuel tanks filled to max capacity only gave the R.11 around 3 hours of endurance. Putting that into perspective of one tank being jettisoned well into a mission, it's reasonable to assume the crew would only have around 30 minutes of life left in the engines in the best case. Granted, this was a better alternative compared to trying to fly and land on only one engine, something that was rather difficult to do in the R.11 initially. Later test pilots would figure out that adding half rudder would allow for a much easier time flying in calm weather on one engine, and one could give their foot a rest by dipping the wing into the side of the failed engine. Due to several unfortunate delays, by the time the R.11 had started production, the idea of a 3-seater fighter aircraft had already seen some level of maturity within the French Air Force, and the introduction of the R.11 appeared to be the perfect fit for the hole seen in the bomber escort formations. France would order 1,000 of the machines, and production began in early 1917. Only a few months after the first flight of an R.11 in 1916. The production model would have a total length of 11.22 meters, be 2.8 meters tall, and have a maximum wingspan of 17.92 meters for the upper wing. Sitting empty, it weighed 1,422 kilograms and could have a maximum takeoff weight of 2,165 kilograms. The top speed is placed at between 184 kilometers an hour and 191 kilometers an hour, with a maximum recorded ceiling of 5,900 meters. This performance made it the perfect aircraft to escort the Brigot 14 B-2 bombers along the edge of the formations, and preparations were made for the introduction of this heavy fighter, with the best students graduating gunnery school being assigned to future squadrons set to receive the R.11. Even though construction had begun in 1917, complications with the production process and the growing pains associated with the 200-horsepower Hispano-Swayze engines delayed the aircraft's deployment all the way into 1918. It wasn't until February of that year that the first squadron, Escort C-46, was finally equipped with the brand new 3-seat fighter. Interestingly, one of the observer gunners within the squadron was American Valentine J. Berger, who had graduated from the French gunnery school with some of the highest marks in the school's history, and officially joined the unit on April 5, 1918, immediately being assigned to one of the squadron's brand new R.11s. The first known combat seen by the R.11 wasn't until July, but it quickly earned a reputation for being a hardy and defendable aircraft. In one early engagement, a small group of R.11s became swarmed by a flight of 12 Falls fighters, hardly even getting a break before the next attack by 7 Fokker D-7s swooped down. By the end of their mission, they had 2 confirmed German aircraft destroyed at the cost of 1 wounded and 1 killed among their gunners. No aircraft lost. Overall, the R.11 was loved by its pilots, and the gunners found immense pride in their assignment. Although only 45 ever entered service before the end of the war, it had earned its reputation and was considered a vital element to the success of the French bomber formations. The aircraft was also surprisingly survivable in a crash. Valentine Berger writes about one such event in his diary on July 19, 1918.
Today, 3 of us went over on combat work, flying over the line from Chateau Thierry to Soissons. I had been at the front row now over 3 months, and today had my first real combat. It was with 5 of the Richthofen Circus, and I believe we got one. When coming back to the field, Greer, Penfield, and Siddeley, who were in one machine, developed engine trouble and had to land in a wheat field. On landing, they turned over, and from up in the air it looked as if it was all over for them. I signaled my pilot at once to land, and after doing so, jumped out of the plane and into our automobile with a few Frenchmen, and drove over to see what was left of the boys. Thank goodness nobody was hurt, although Penfield had his bald head scratched a bit, and Greer got a small cut over the eye caused by the breaking of his goggles. Siddeley, when the plane turned over, was held strapped in the seat upside down, and after the others had cleared themselves of the wreck and tried to release him, they finally pressed the button which releases the straps, and he fell out of the seat to the ground on his head. It was a lucky escape for the 3.
The issues of overturning and chronic engine trouble were stereotypical of the R.11 due to both the unreliable engines and overall weight distribution in the aircraft's design. This was more than offset in the eyes of the crew by its sturdiness and ease to fly. As time went on, changes were made to how the R.11 was used, eventually situated to act as a hole punch, to fly out ahead of the bomber formations and clear out the enemy fighters, destroying or tiring them out to keep the bomber safe and turn the German pilots into easy pickings for the more agile and fresh French single-seaters sticking closer to the bomber formations itself. This, of course, led to higher casualties, something that was expected by the crews of the R.11 in the French Air Force Command. Crews were told they were to sacrifice themselves for the protection of the bombers in order to ensure victory, something the R.11 crews were already used to doing. A great example is another journal entry from Berger, recalling one of his last flights with the French squadron on August 11th.
Suddenly, my pilot called my attention to about 6 Huns in formation, diving on our bombers. At the same time, he put our machine into a dive straight into the Huns, and I let go at them with my Lewis gun, holding my finger on the trigger, and had the pleasure of seeing my stream of bullets hit one plane and tear off its left wing. And then it went down in flames. We were a happy lot in our plane, as if it was our first plane, and destroyed in such a manner that we knew there was absolutely no chance of him getting to the ground alive.
Berger's plane would land in a field after getting lost, losing the landing gear but keeping from flipping over. He took this as a sign and requested a small leave from duty, which was approved. The plane shot down was more than likely the Fokker D-7 piloted by Lieutenant Hans Pippart of Josta 19. No witnesses or reports of his crash noticed him conducting any evasive maneuvers before losing his wing, that likely being caused by him not expecting a twin-engine aircraft to dive on him in such a crazed manner, let alone into the teeth of an enemy air squadron. Berger continued to get lucky, as the mission conducted while he was on leave saw the R.11 he had been scheduled to go up in shot down with all aboard lost. The previous mission saw the several R.11 shot down in a thick firefight. The lucky Penfield from earlier had been shot down, later found to have been killed in action in the mission. Second Lieutenant Berger would go on to serve in the 90th Aero Squadron, being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross with a bronze oak leaf cluster for extraordinary heroism during 2 missions flown on October 27th and November 1st, 1918. He would survive the war with 3 aerial victories to his name. He passed away on October 18th, 1962, at the age of 71. He is currently buried in the Beverly National Cemetery, New Jersey. After the armistice, France canceled all future production of the R.11, but accepted the 370 made up to that point into their Air Force. Britain had been given 1 for evaluation, and America had special ordered 2 to go along with the 1 leased to them by the French in October of 1918. While improved models such as the R.12 and R.14 were being developed, they were abandoned upon the signing of the armistice. France would keep its own R.11s in service for a couple of years, and the U.S. brought its 2 home and stuck them in storage to use in a planned Army Air Corps museum. A photo from that era, which shows a disassembled R.11 among other World War I aircraft, is the last known photo of any R.11 known to exist. The other R.11s taken home by the U.S. completely disappeared without a trace, most likely being scrapped during the Great Depression. France would retire the last of its R.11s in 1922, scrapping them all, leaving the idea of a flying cruiser, once again, abandoned.